Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we cut through the noise to get you truly well-informed. Today, we're diving into something that might just shake your understanding of history a bit. It's this idea that ancient Chinese astronomical records give us this perfect, unbroken timeline going back thousands of years. You know, the kind of thing that anchors a lot of global history.
Yeah, exactly. And that foundation, that's precisely what our sources for today are putting under the microscope. We're unpacking some, let's say, really controversial claims.
Right, from mathematicians Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nosovsky.
That's them, their work, specifically a piece called The Issue with Chinese Astronomy. It's part of this bigger theories they have called history, fiction, or science.
And they propose this thing called the new chronology, which, well, it basically turns accepted history on its head.
It really does. Their core idea, and it's a pretty bold one, is that most of what we think of as ancient history, it's actually much shorter, much more recent than we believe.
Shorter how?
They think it's mostly just the Middle Ages kind of duplicated or folded back onto itself. So most famous historical events, they argue they happen between, say, 81,000 and 1500.
Wow. So for them, reliable written history only goes back to maybe AD 800.
That's their line, yeah. Pretty radical.
Okay, so our mission today for you listening is to really dig into their specific arguments about Chinese astronomy. We'll look at the evidence they use for these, frankly, extraordinary claims.
And just as important, we'll look at the pushback, you know, the counter-arguments from mainstream historians and scientists.
Right. We want you to understand what's being claimed, why Fomenko and Nosovsky think this, and how the academic world responds. Let's get into it.
Okay, so Fomenko and Nosovsky, they start by questioning the whole premise, this idea that Chinese chronology, especially the part based on astronomy, is super ancient and reliable.
They think it's mostly misconception.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
They argue that popular beliefs are often wrong, and they actually state, quite bluntly, that the work on the reconstruction of Chinese history has only just begun.
Oof. Okay, so where do they start the attack?
Comments. The Chinese Comet Catalogues. These are often held up as these incredibly detailed historical records, right?
Yeah, like the Annals, the Shiki. Supposedly starts way back 2650 BC and runs up to the 1640s.
That's one. And the Encyclopedia of the Forest Horse, Matuan Lin, covering 611 BC to 1644.
Okay, standard stuff so far.
Right. But here's their first big point. They cite this finding from Naum Morosov.
Morozov. Who's he?
Another researcher whose work they build on quite a bit. Morozov claimed that no Chinese manuscripts whatsoever can be reliably dated before the 17th century. None.
Wait, none? What about all those ancient records?
Well, the usual explanation, paper is fragile, especially compared to European parchment. But Morozov and Fomenko and Nosovsky follow him here. They're suspicious.
Suspicious how?
They actually suggest that maybe Catholic missionaries helped compile these records in the 17th century.
Whoa, that's a massive claim. Missionaries faking ancient records.
Or maybe assisting is the word they use. But yeah, it fundamentally questions the source material's age. And it gets layered.
How so?
They then point out that these supposedly ancient Chinese comet lists, they were actually expanded quite a bit in Europe during the 18th and 19th centuries.
Expanded, like adding more comets.
Yeah, and with clear signs of borrowing between different European sources compiling these Chinese lists, it starts to look less like a pristine ancient record and more like a later compilation.
Okay, I see the thread they're pulling. What else?
The frequency of observations, they call it suspiciously high.
Too many comets.
Think about it.
Yeah.
How many really bright, noticeable comets have you seen in, say, the last 50 years? Maybe a few if you're lucky.
Right, not many.
Yet these ancient Chinese records supposedly list sightings of tiny, barely visible comets almost every 3 years. For centuries.
Nice. What'd they even do that?
Exactly.
Nah.
Fomenko and Nosovsky point to 19th century Chinese star charts, calling them childishly naive, primitive, no-coordinate grids, making identifying specific faint objects incredibly hard.
So how could those charts lead to such frequent, detailed observations?
Their point, precisely, they put it quite poetically. Interstellar vagabonds don't quite reign over us in such abundance as one finds in the roster of Chinese comets.
And does the physical evidence back up millennia of skywatching?
Well, that's another issue they raise. There's a striking lack of descriptions of astronomical instruments in these early Chinese texts.
No telescopes, obviously, but not even basic tools.
Or even detailed accounts of observatories. You compare that to, say, Ptolemy's Almagest from the ancient Greek world. which is full of descriptions of instruments and methods.
It's a big contrast.
The very stark contrast, yeah. It makes you wonder how these supposed millennia of meticulous observation actually happened.
Okay, so comet records look shaky according to them. What about eclipses? Those are usually pretty solid astronomical markers for dating, right?
You'd think so. But Fomenko and Nosovsky argue that Chinese eclipse descriptions are just too vague to date.
Vague.
They often miss the really crucial details, like what was the phase of the eclipse? Total, partial, and crucially, where was it observed from? Without that info.
You can't reliably calculate when it happened.
Exactly. They're pretty much useless for precise historical dating, according to Fomenko.
Is there an example they use?
Yeah, they point to the Chinese history of the Khitan state. It reports eclipses happening with almost impossible regularity in the same region.
Like when?
Get this, 9982, 994, 998, 999, 1002, 1004, 1007. You just can't have distinctly observable total solar eclipses hitting the same territory that frequently. It's astronomically impossible.
So the conclusion is,
these eclipse observations, they can't confirm the traditional timeline, but they also can't refute it. They're just data points without enough context to be useful for dating.
okay, so comets are questionable, eclipses are vague. What about horoscopes? Ancient cultures loved those.
Ah, yes. They focus on what Morozov claimed was the only actual horoscope he could find connected to ancient Chinese history.
Only one, really.
According to Morozov, yeah. And this one was supposedly linked to the grandson of the Yellow Emperor.
The Yellow Emperor, traditionally way back, like 3rd millennium BC.
That's the traditional date. And the horoscope described a specific event, the convergence of 5 planets near Aquarius.
Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, all clustered.
Yep, the 5 classical planets visible to the naked eye.
So Fomenko and Nosovsky thought, okay, let's check this with modern software. Can we find this alignment back then? And their calculations showed no such alignment of those 5 planets near Aquarius happened anywhere in the 3rd millennium BC.
Seriously, the traditional date is just wrong, according to their math.
According to their astronomical calculations, yes. But they did find solutions later on.
Oh, when?
2 excellent solutions, they call them. One was February 15th, 1108 AD. They actually think this one fits better because the planets were technically in Capricorn right next door, plus it was a new moon and the right season, according to the description.
1108 AD. That's
Yeah.
a medieval times, not ancient. What was the other date? February 6th, 1524 AD.
Whoa. So 12th century or even the 16th century.
Exactly. Which leads them to conclude it's very likely that this grandson of the Yellow Emperor actually lived in the 16th century.
That completely rewrites that part of history. But hang on, surely other people tried to date this horoscope before.
They did. And Fomenko and Nosovsky don't mince words here. They claim that previous attempts to confirm the ancient date were actual forgeries.
Forgeries? How?
They mention one scholar, Bailey, who apparently just excluded Jupiter and Saturn from his calculations because they didn't fit the ancient date he wanted.
You can't just leave out planets.
Well, Fomenko claims that's what happened, specifically to prop up what they call the Scaligerine chronology.
The Scaligerine chronology. Right, that's the standard timeline, the one developed by Scaliger and others back in the day.
Exactly, the one Fomenko thinks is fundamentally wrong. So they're essentially accusing earlier researchers of deliberately manipulating data to fit the accepted history.
Okay, that's a pretty heavy accusation. What else do they apply this critical lens to?
The famous Chinese 60-year cycle, the Zodiac cycle, often said to go back to the Yellow Emperor again, 2638 BC.
Right, very ancient, supposedly.
Well, Morozov had a different idea. He thought it wasn't some mystical ancient thing, but based on something astronomical. The conjunction period of Jupiter and Saturn.
Jupiter and Saturn meeting up, that was a big deal astrologically, wasn't it? Especially later, in the Middle Ages.
A very big deal. So Fomenko and Nosovsky calculated, when did the actual astronomical conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn line up perfectly with the start of the calendar's 60-year cycles?
And the result?
The perfect alignment only happened between 1204 AD and 1623 AD.
Only in that medieval window.
Yep. Which leads them to conclude that this supposedly ancient cycle was introduced, quote, in the 13th century AD, the earliest, most likely in the 14th century.
So, again, pulling something thought to be millennia old into the much more recent past.
Consistently, yeah, that's the pattern they're building.
And this pattern extends even to technology, like the telescope.
Yeah, this one's pretty wild. We all learned Galileo invented the telescope, right? Early 17th century.
Pretty standard historical fact.
Okay, but Fomenko and Nosovsky point to the Chinese Book of Songs, the Xi Qing. Traditionally, It's dated to the 6th century BC, edited by Confucius himself.
Ancient text. What's in it?
Well, according to them, it describes some surprisingly advanced astronomical knowledge for that era. Things like a 366-day year, knowing about the Julian years, even understanding precession, that slow wobble of Earth's axis.
Knowledge that's sophisticated back then.
They argue this level of knowledge really corresponds more to European astronomy in the 15th or 16th centuries AD. They even add kind of dryly, modern historians aren't surprised by this fact for some reason.
Okay, but where does the telescope come in?
Here's the kicker. The Book of Songs apparently mentions a looking glass.
A looking glass?
Yeah, it used to make the 7 mobile luminaries, that's the sun, moon, and the 5 visible planets, observable daily.
Observable daily. With a looking glass, what are they implying?
They state it's a direct implication that Galileo's telescope was known to the Chinese 4,000 years before the great European scientists.
4,000 years. That's mind-blowing if true, but highly speculative, surely.
Oh, absolutely. But it fits their narrative of advanced knowledge appearing too early in the conventional timeline.
Okay, this brings us to Halley's Comet. Now, this is often used as proof for the accuracy of Chinese records, right?
Exactly. It was kind of the poster child. Halley's Comet is famous, its return is predictable now, and the idea is that ancient Chinese sightings confirm its long-term motion, which in turn validates their chronology. It's seen as a linchpin.
So how do Fomenko and Nosovsky tackle this cornerstone?
They don't just tackle it, they try to demolish it. They make the flat-out claim that all reported observations of Halley's Comet before the 15th century are, quote, utter disinformation and were fabricated in the 8th century.
All of them fabricated. That's not just questioning, that's alleging massive fraud.
You'd call it a strict assertion. They're not hedging their bets.
Why? What's the basis for such a strong claim? Didn't astronomers like Cowell and Crommelin use these Chinese records?
They did in the early 20th century, and they found excellent correspondence between their calculated orbit for Halley and the dates listed in the Chinese records going way back to 86 BC.
So the records looked good, even better than European ones.
Yeah, Fomenko notes that European observations were considered a great deal worse. So on the surface, the Chinese data seemed almost unnervingly perfect.
Okay. So what's the problem Fomenko sees?
The problem came much later, with the 1986 apparition of Halley's Comet.
I remember that one. Bit of a damp squib visibility-wise, wasn't it?
Exactly. Crucially, it was not visible from the northern hemisphere. You really needed to be in the southern hemisphere to see it well.
Okay. And why is that significant?
Because it completely contradicts the picture painted by 2,000 years of Chinese records, which imply that every single apparition was observable from China in the northern hemisphere.
Ah, so a sudden change in visibility.
A very odd indeed, and drastic change in the motion pattern, as they put it. For Fomenko, this discrepancy alone strongly doubts the veracity of the traditional chronology of Comet Halley's sightings.
That's one point. What else?
They talk about the periodicity found in the Chinese records, the time between returns.
It should vary slightly because of planetary gravity, right?
It should, but Fomenko claims the Chinese records show an exceptionally precise centenarian regularity. He calls it a Chinese sawtooth curve.
Meaning
the pattern of return dates repeats almost perfectly over long stretches. Like the pattern from 218 AD to 989 AD is supposedly almost identical to the pattern from 989 AD to 1759 AD.
Yeah.
Just repeating almost without variation.
That sounds too perfect, like clockwork.
Precisely. Too good to be true, according to Fomenko. And here's the real killer for their argument.
Yeah.
The supposed Chinese experimental law of perfect periodicity, it completely breaks down after 1759. Halley's Comet showed up 3.5 years earlier than that law predicted in 1910. And again in 1986, the timing was off. The actual time between returns is reducing, not following that perfect repeating pattern.
So the law derived from the ancient records failed its modern tests.
Spectacularly. For Fomenko and Nosovsky, this delivers a mortal blow to the Scaligerine chronology because that chronology relies on those records being accurate.
So their conclusion about this perfect pattern.
It's manifestly false. It cannot possibly reflect the real sightings or the real trajectory, so it must be either of a random nature or a forgery.
Okay, if it's a forgery, how do they think it happened and why?
They propose a timeline. They think maybe a few key fabricated dates, perhaps just 3 were inserted into the records, sometime between 1759 and 1835.
Why that window?
Because 1759 was a well-observed return, establishing the pattern. Inserting a few earlier dates would make the law look perfect before the 1835 return, which, like later ones, started to deviate significantly.
So patch the records just before the pattern breaks down.
That's the idea. And they note this timing fits with when more detailed Chinese rosters started appearing in Europe, like Biot's publication in 1846, which were more comprehensive than the 17th century versions.
And the motivation? Was it malicious?
Interestingly, they suggest maybe not. They propose a theory of noble intentions.
Noble intentions?
Yeah.
To fake data?
Imagine someone, maybe not an expert astronomer, but knowing Halley's approximate cycle from the 18th century, trying to reconstruct the voracious picture of the distant past.
Okay.
This person sees the pattern in the 18th century and just copies it backwards mechanically.
Yeah.
They look through the very dense Chinese chronicles, find dates that almost match what their artificial pattern predicts, maybe tweak a few or insert one or two missing ones.
And they wouldn't realize the problem.
They wouldn't realize, Fomenko argues, that because the original Chinese records were already so packed with observations, many perhaps unrelated, you could probably find dates to substantiate almost any periodic cycle you were looking for.
So an accidental forgery driven by a desire to make history look neat and orderly.
That's their theory. Then later, professional astronomers like Cowell and Cromwell come along, find this neat pattern already sitting in the compiled records, and assume it's real.
Right.
They canonize this artificial construct into a law of nature.
And what does modern physics say about Halley's orbit? Is it regular?
Definitely not perfectly regular. That's a key point. Its orbit is known to be chaotic.
Chaotic?
Yeah, meaning small gravitational nudges, especially from Jupiter, get amplified over time, making its exact return period slightly unpredictable, essentially a random value over long time scales. They cite research by Chirikov and Vyakoslavov from 1989 confirming this chaotic behavior.
So a perfectly repeating sawtooth curve, like the one they claim is in the Chinese records, is just astronomically impossible for Halley's Comet.
Pretty much. Fomenko uses the analogy. Finding that perfect pattern randomly is as likely as a monkey typing out War and Peace. It just shouldn't happen naturally.
And they see this kind of too good to be true pattern elsewhere in history.
They claim these sorts of mass-produced coincidences seem to only happen in traditional history before the 16th century. They pose the question, how come it has only been conforming to the rules of the probability theory for the last 400 years, after having stubbornly ignored the laws of mathematical statistics for centuries on end?
Are there other comet examples they use?
They mention the comet of 1556, associated with Emperor Charles V. An astronomer named Pingré tried to link it to a comet from 1264, proposing a 292-year cycle. Then he went searching for earlier records that fit that cycle.
So finding a pattern and then looking for data to confirm it.
Exactly. Fomenko uses this to argue that astronomers sometimes trust these rosters too much, not considering that the rosters themselves might be much younger or compiled differently than assumed.
And Morozov found another strange pattern.
Yeah, Morozov apparently found a strange tendency for all comets listed before 59 AD, in both European and Chinese lists, to seem to recur with a 540-year period. Even the gabs and observations repeated on this cycle.
That sounds really weird. A 540-year echo for all ancient comets.
Fomenko and Nosovsky jump on this. They suggest it means historical events linked to these early comets were somehow artificially shifted backwards in time by 540 years, or maybe twice that, 1080 years.
Which fits their idea of history being folded or duplicated.
Precisely. It supports their core concept that chunks of history were copied and pasted into earlier periods, making the timeline seem much longer than it was.
Okay, this is a good point to maybe summarize their bigger picture, the new chronology itself. What are the absolute core claims?
The absolute core is conventional history, the Scaligerine timeline, is fundamentally flawed. History is much, much shorter.
Radically shorter.
Radically.
Yeah.
Ancient history, as we know it, is basically a phantom echo of the Middle Ages, roughly AD 1000 to 1500. That's when they think most recorded events actually happened.
And all the ancient sources we have.
They argue they're all based on manuscripts written after the 15th to 18th centuries.
Yeah.
Any supposedly earlier originals. Conveniently lost, they'd say.
It sounds like they're implying a massive, deliberate rewriting of history.
That's definitely part of the implication. And they have some truly startling examples of historical mergers that result from this.
Let's hear a few. These are the ones that really cause jaws to drop.
Oh, yeah. For instance, they propose Jesus Christ is a composite figure. His story, they claim, is primarily based on the life of a Byzantine emperor, Andronikos Ikomnenos.
Who lived when?
AD 1152 to 1185, so 12th century. not 1st century.
Okay, that's huge. What else?
They merge iconic ancient cities, Jerusalem, ancient Rome, and ancient Troy. They claim these are all actually references to the same place. New Rome, which is Constantinople, or maybe a nearby fortress called Euros Castle.
All those distinct places are one place.
In their model, yes.
Yeah.
Phantom reflections of one medieval reality. And it continues.
Go on.
The Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. They identify that as the biblical Temple of Solomon.
Wow. And Solomon himself.
He becomes Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottoman Sultan, who lived from 1494 to 1566.
So King Solomon is pulled forward by over 2,000 years.
According to Fomenko, yes. You can see how this just dismantles everything we think we know about ancient geography, religion, timelines.
It's a complete paradigm shift. What about foundational texts like the Bible or Ptolemy?
They argue the Bible wasn't finalized until the Council of Trent, mid-16th century. And Ptolemy's Almagest, that cornerstone of ancient astronomy, compiled much later, 16th, 17th centuries, using data collected between the 9th and 16th centuries.
Not ancient Greek at all.
Nope. Even Egyptian horoscopes, like the famous Dendera zodiacs you see in museums, they date them to the 11th to 19th centuries AD.
Medieval to modern. And didn't they redate a Greek historian too?
Thucydides. Based on his description of eclipses, they redate his famous eclipse triad, not to ancient Greece, but to AD 1039, 1046, and 1057.
Meaning Thucydides was writing history in the 11th century.
That's the implication. He becomes a medieval historian describing events mistakenly placed over 1,000 years earlier.
Okay, the claims are staggering. How do they actually build this alternative history? What's the method beyond questioning specific records?
They rely heavily on mathematical and statistical methods, which makes sense given their background. One key technique is statistical correlation of texts.
How did that work?
It's kind of abstract. They take a historical text, note down which years are mentioned, and assign a numerical space, like the number of pages or lines devoted to events in each year. This creates a kind of profile or density function for the text.
A historical fingerprint based on coverage?
Sort of, yeah. Then they compare these fingerprints between different histories. For example, they compare Livy's history of ancient Rome to a modern history of Rome and find a high correlation which you'd expect. They cover the same topic.
Okay, that makes sense.
But they also claim to find a high correlation between histories of ancient Rome and histories of medieval Rome.
And they interpret that
as evidence that the ancient history is just a phantom duplicate or retelling of the medieval history. The same historical shape, just misplaced in time.
That's a unique way to analyze texts. Do they do something similar with rulers or dynasties?
They do. Statistical correlation of dynasties. They create these survey codes for rulers.
Codes based on what?
Things like how long they ruled, how they died, maybe major events during their reign. They turn rulers into data points.
And then compare the patterns.
Exactly. And they claim to find statistically unlikely parallels between dynasties that conventional history sees as completely separate and centuries apart.
Like who?
The example often cited is finding correlations between the kings of Israel in the Old Testament and the Roman emperors from, say, the 1st to 4th centuries AD.
Wait, the kings of Israel match Roman emperors statistically?
That's their claim. They argue these parallels are too strong to be chance, suggesting one is a historical reflection of the other. But interestingly, they say these odd correlations disappear when they look at more recent history, like the 17th to 20th centuries.
Implying that recent history is recorded correctly, but older history is duplicated.
That's the idea. It leads back to their core point.
Yeah.
It's all about how you handle the data. Are you finding real patterns, or are you maybe selecting or tweaking the data, perhaps unintentionally, to create patterns? Correlation isn't causation, especially if you're looking really hard for correlations.
Right, and tied into this is their wholesale rejection of standard dating methods, correct?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
They basically dismiss archaeology, dendrochronology, tree ring dating, paleography, studying old handwriting, and especially radiocarbon dating.
Dismiss them how?
They label them all non-exact and contradictory. They claim nothing can be reliably dated before the 11th century using these methods.
What's their specific beef with, say, tree rings?
They call dendrochronology only a relative method for old trees and claim there's a break in the tree ring sequences around 81,000, making it impossible to bridge the gap reliably to earlier times.
And carbon dating, that's the big one.
They attack its accuracy, especially in the period 81 to 2000, citing too many sources of error, and then they make a pretty cynical claim.
Which is...
They allege that dating labs, basically no historians want certain dates, So the labs just politely bill for their fiddling and fine-tuning to get the dates to order of historians.
So they're accusing labs of essentially faking results to fit expectations.
Yeah, they call it a circulus viciosus, a vicious circle where the desired answer influences the result.
What about dating using coins? Numismatics.
Also dismissed as circular. They argue that finding similar coins doesn't prove they're from the same period. Maybe styles were just copied much later.
Okay, so they've presented their case, questioned astronomy, proposed statistical methods, rejected standard dating. You have to ask, what does the mainstream academic world think of all this?
Well, to put it mildly, it's not accepted. Fomenko's ideas are pretty much universally rejected by mainstream scholars. The term frequently used is pseudo-history.
Why the strong rejection? Is it just because it's radical?
It's more about the methodology, critics say. They accuse Fomenko of serious flaws, things like altering the data to improve the fit with his ideas. Basically, cherry-picking. Violating a key rule of statistics by selecting the historical matches that support his chronology and just ignoring the vast majority that don't.
So, confirmation bias on a grand scale.
That's the accusation, his text correlation method. Critics call it very rough, saying it completely ignores vital context, like the language used, the writing style, the different aims of the historians.
It treats history texts like simple data streams.
Pretty much. And the dynasty correlations.
Yeah.
Again, accusations of forcing the data. Critics say Fomenko achieves his matches by arbitrarily rearranging rulers, merging reigns, or just dropping inconvenient kings or emperors from the lists until he gets a pattern he likes.
That sounds problematic.
A Russian linguist, Andrei Zalizniak, famously argued that using Fomenko's loose methods, you could probably prove a statistical link between any two dynasties, like ancient Egyptian pharaohs and French kings. It highlights how subjective the pattern matching can be.
What about the astronomical arguments? Do mainstream astronomers agree with his analysis?
No, that's another area where he faces heavy criticism for selectivity.
Selectivity how?
Critics say he picks isolated astronomical examples that seem to support his theory, but ignores the mountain of astronomical data that contradicts it.
Like with the Almagest dating.
Exactly. He based his redating of Ptolemy's star catalog on just 8 stars he chose. One of those stars had a known large error in its recorded position, and this one bad data point had a dominant effect on his entire calculation, pulling the date forward artificially.
What happens if you use more stars?
When other researchers did statistical analysis using all the suitable stars in the Almagest, the result confirmed its antiquity, consistent with Ptolemy's time, not the Middle Ages.
And the eclipses. Fomenko said they were too vague.
Well, astronomer F.R. Stevenson did a huge systematic study looking at numerous eclipse records, Babylonian, European, Chinese. He found they could be dated consistently with the conventional timeline back to around 600 BCE.
So they are useful for dating.
Stevenson's work suggests yes, and that the accumulated uncertainty in Earth's rotation over that time is actually quite small. It directly contradicts Fomenko's claim that these records are useless. The consensus astronomical evidence doesn't support the new chronology.
Okay, and what about the sheer scale of the supposed falsification Fomenko alleges? This idea that history before 1600 was deliberately rewritten.
That's where the conspiracy theory element really comes in. He claims Western European historians and humanists in the 16th, 17th centuries systematically falsified the past for political reasons.
Meaning they destroyed real documents, forged others.
Exactly. An enormous coordinated effort across Europe for centuries.
What do critics say to that?
One major piece of counter-evidence is numismatics coins.
Ah, right. He dismissed coins, but what's the counter?
There are just vast quantities of ancient coins found all over the world. They're consistently dug up in archaeological contexts that match the traditional timeline, and they bear the names and images of rulers associated with those periods. For Fomenko's theory to work,
You'd need someone to have counterfeited millions of coins across hundreds of types and somehow distributed them perfectly in the ground to fool future archaeologists.
precisely. It implies a level of coordinated forgery and deception that seems almost impossibly vast and complex, far beyond just a few scholars with noble intentions.
Has the academic world formally responded?
Oh, yeah. Besides countless papers refuting specific points, Fomenko and Nosovsky actually received an anti-prize in Russia in 2004.
An anti-prize?
Yeah, the Absats Prize, awarded by the Moscow International Book Fair for esteemed nonsense.
Oh.
And academic reviews can be scathing. H.G. Van Buren, an astronomy professor emeritus, reviewed their work and called it absolutely worthless. even comparing it unfavorably to politically motivated pseudoscience like Lysenkoism of the Soviet era. He basically labeled it useless and misleading.
Strong words. So finally, what about those dating methods Fomenko rejects? Are they really as flawed as he claims?
Mainstream scientists would say absolutely not. Of course, they acknowledge that all scientific methods have limitations and require careful application and calibration. They do rigorously examine and refine techniques like carbon dating and dendrochronology.
What's the reality of tree ring dating, for instance? Did it stop around 81,000?
No. Scientists say they have independent, overlapping tree ring sequences that go back consistently for 12,400 years.
12,000 years, not just 1,000.
Correct. And these long sequences are mutually consistent across different regions, and they provide the backbone for calibrating radiocarbon dates very precisely. The latest calibration curves, based on tree rings, allow dating back 26,000 years, with an internal error of only about 163 years.
So much more robust than Fomenko claims.
Far more robust. The picture from multiple cross-verified dating methods paints a consistent view of the past that aligns with conventional chronology, not Fomenko's radical shortening.
Okay, so wrapping this up, we've been through this deep dive into these really audacious claims by Fomenko and Nosovsky. They used astronomical arguments, particularly questioning Chinese records, statistical methods, and a rejection of standard dating to propose this new chronology where history is dramatically shorter.
Right, a history folded onto the Middle Ages involving widespread fabrication, possibly some with noble intentions regarding Halley's Comet, maybe more deliberate falsification elsewhere.
And then we looked at the mainstream response. Universal rejection, accusations of major methodological flaws, cherry-picking data, statistical manipulation, ignoring vast counter-evidence from astronomy, archaeology, coins, and robust dating methods.
Yeah, a real clash between a radical mathematical reinterpretation and the established consensus across multiple scientific and historical fields.
It certainly leaves you thinking. Which brings us to our final provocative thought for you, the listener.
In a world where historical sources can be incredibly dense, where records might have been expanded or maybe even unconsciously massaged over time to fit expected patterns, and where maybe, just maybe, some distortions happened with noble intentions, how do we actually tell the difference?
Yeah, how do you, as someone trying to learn about the past, distinguish between a genuine historical event, a weird statistical fluke that looks like a pattern, or maybe a detail that was perhaps fabricated even with good intentions centuries ago? What does it truly mean to be well-informed when the very bedrock of ancient history is subject to such intense, even a fringe debate? Something to ponder.